Have you ever touched something so gently, just to see if it would pull away? Sometimes, the quietest sounds aren't made to be heard, they're made to be felt. And every once in a while, the softest touch can shift the stillness of an entire room. If you believe that not every note has to be loud to matter. If you've ever held back, afraid to break something delicate, but longed for it to stay, then like and subscribe. Stay with us, because today, a little boy doesn't play the harp to make music. He sits beside it, just to see if anything will let him be near, without flinching. The harp stood on a wooden platform, lit just enough to glow, but never invite. Strings silent. Gold frame spotless. And for the regulars of the alabaster room, it was nothing more than part of the scenery. A visual note in a carefully composed dining experience where no one ever reached out of turn. Except for one pair of eyes. Every evening, while the other children scribbled on menus or stirred straws in their sodas, an 8-year-old boy named Henry would sit cross-legged near the edge of the small elevated stage. Not on it, never on it. Just close enough to see the curves of the harp, to watch how light traced the strings when the wind from the air conditioning moved the velvet curtain behind it. He didn't speak. He didn't move. And he certainly didn't play. But he watched, with the kind of stare adults tend to mistake for spacing out, but anyone paying attention could recognize as longing. Thomas Gale, the boy's father, never let anyone get too close. Not to the harp. Not to Henry. The billionaire insurance tycoon, known in headlines for founding Gale Mutual and in whispers for the chain of hospitals he privately bankrolled, had lost his wife 8 years ago, shortly after Henry was born. Complications from a postnatal stroke, they said. He never remarried. He never smiled. And he never let Henry be handled. Henry had sensory processing sensitivity, touch especially. The brush of a sleeve could send him reeling, a hand on the shoulder could trigger a meltdown. Every caregiver, therapist, and school aide knew the rule, no touching. And Thomas made sure the staff at the alabaster room followed it to the letter. No hugs. No nudging. No hand-holding. The boy must be left alone, always. But not completely. That's what Nina Carter saw. At 27, she'd been working the dinner shifts for just over a year. Kind, fast-footed, and quieter than most, Nina had quickly become a favorite of the regulars, though few knew her well. Fewer still knew she used to play the harp. Not well. Not long. And not enough to make a living. She dropped out of her conservatory after her second year. Scholarships had dried up, and part-time waitressing didn't cover string replacements, let alone lessons. So she stopped playing. Sold her harp. Stopped saying the word. Until she saw Henry. 3 nights in a row, she noticed him. Always sitting in the same place, always during the quiet lull between salads and mains. His gaze was fixed, not on his father, not on the waiters, but on that harp. Not once did he inch closer. But not once did he look away. Nina noticed the way his hands fidgeted, never with a napkin or fork, but in the air, as if his fingers were testing the shape of something invisible. A vibration he couldn't touch. She didn't ask permission. She didn't make a scene. She waited until her section cleared, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked, slowly carefully, toward the stage. Not toward the boy. Toward the harp. She didn't speak. Didn't bend down. Didn't offer a smile. Just stepped up onto the small platform, gently unlatched the side gate, and opened it, wide enough for someone to pass through, but not so much it would be noticed from across the room. Then, she walked away. No invitation. No gesture. No come on, sweetie. Just space. Henry didn't move for a full minute. His eyes shifted. His legs twitched. And then, with the softest breath, he stood. His sneakers didn't stomp, they barely whispered. He moved one step forward. Then another. Then another. He climbed the step and stood next to the harp. And Nina? She didn't hover. She didn't praise him. She simply watched from the far side of the dining floor, her tray half full, her hands still. He didn't pluck. He didn't strum. But he stood. The harp remained silent, but something in the air had shifted. Nina didn't expect him to follow. That wasn't the point. She'd seen the way Henry operated, or didn't. The boy moved like he had invisible weights tethered to each limb, not from weakness, but calculation. Every step cost him something. Every gesture carried risk. And people didn't make it easier. So when she opened that small side gate to the stage the night before, she wasn't hoping he'd run toward the harp. She just wanted to make space. Space that didn't ask, didn't demand, didn't presume. Now, one evening later, she did something even smaller. She returned to the stage between her orders, apron still tied, hair pinned back, tray resting behind the curtain. The dining room was calm, with a low hum of conversation filling the air. Thomas Gale was on a call at the corner table, one AirPod in, scrolling through some financial spreadsheet that looked more like a heartbeat monitor than a menu. Henry was in his usual spot, sitting cross-legged near the base of the stage, his eyes pinned to the harp. Not the strings. Not the wood. The whole of it. Like it was a living thing. Nina didn't address him. She didn't wave. She just stepped quietly onto the stage, unlatched the gate again, smoother this time, and let it swing open silently. She walked over to the harp, a gentle arc to her step, and pulled one of the chairs nearby, the kind used for soloists during special events, toward the instrument. Still no words. She placed the chair slightly angled beside the harp, not directly in front of it. Not where a teacher might sit to instruct a child. Off to the side. Equal, not looming. Then, she sat. She crossed one leg over the other, resting her hands gently on her lap, her fingers softly curled as if they still remembered where the strings once lived. Her eyes didn't meet Henry's, not because she didn't care, but because she knew how heavy a glance could feel. She let the moment stretch. And then, almost imperceptibly, Henry shifted. It was the tiniest change in posture, the lift of his shoulder, the uncrossing of his feet. His fingers began to twitch again, not in distress, but in rhythm. As if something invisible was pulsing beneath his skin. Then slowly, achingly slowly, he stood. Not a dramatic rise, not a cinematic revelation. Just a boy, standing up from the floor with the same deliberateness one might use when lifting glass from water. He didn't look at her. He didn't check if his father was watching. He simply walked, one step, two, then three, toward the open gate. Nina didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't encourage. When Henry reached the edge of the stage, he hesitated. Not because he was afraid, but because he was making sure the space still welcomed him. It did. He climbed the shallow steps, one hand brushing the wall lightly, not for balance, but confirmation. When he reached the chair beside the harp, he paused again. Nina quietly rose. She stepped back slowly with care, the way you step out of sunlight so someone else can see better. No performance. No fuss. Just retreat. Henry looked at the chair, then at the harp, then at Nina, for half a second. He sat. The harp towered over him, elegant and tall, the strings shimmering slightly under the golden light from above. His hands hovered, not daring to touch yet. But they were there, in proximity. In curiosity. Nina noticed the way the instrument trembled, just slightly. Not from Henry, but from its own unbalanced base. The platform wasn't flat, and the harp's weight leaned awkwardly. A small bump could knock it over. Without a word, Nina reached forward, one hand gently gripping the top curve of the harp's frame, just enough to steady it. She didn't adjust it. Didn't lift it. Just held. And once Henry leaned in, hands still not touching the strings, but breathing the space between them, she quietly released her grip and stepped away. Thomas Gale wasn't supposed to arrive early. His driver had dropped him off 15 minutes ahead of schedule, citing unexpected light traffic. The billionaire stepped into the dining hall of the alabaster room with the casual alertness of someone used to scanning a room in seconds, taking in faces, tables, exits. But this time he froze. There, at the far end of the room, on the modestly lit stage that had always been just ornamental, sat his son. Not near the harp. Not staring at it from a safe distance. Sitting beside it. Worse. Henry's left hand was resting gently on one of the strings. Thomas's chest tightened. For a full beat, the room fell away. The tables, the waitstaff, the soft jazz playing from overhead, all of it dissolved into background fog. All he could see was the boy and the harp. He didn't yell. He didn't storm the stage. But his eyes sharpened into something glacial, cold, hard, and unreadable. To anyone who had worked with him long enough, the look was unmistakable. Someone had broken the rules. And not just a guideline or suggestion, a boundary he'd forged in grief and guarded with his own reputation. For years, he'd made it crystal clear, Henry was not to be taken near instruments. Not touched. Not enticed. Not invited. Because Thomas had witnessed what happened when people tried. The crying, the flinching, the sudden lashes of fear and fury. The mess. The judgment. The shame. And so he'd locked that world away. What he saw now wasn't just surprising, it was a betrayal. His son, unmoving but not distressed. Sitting perfectly still in the presence of the one thing Thomas had always considered off-limits. The boy's hand on the string didn't press or pull, it simply rested there, light enough that it barely disturbed the tension, but enough that the contact was undeniable. Then he saw her. Nina. She stood a few feet off to the side, her apron still tied, hands loose by her sides. Her eyes weren't pleading. She wasn't defensive. She didn't even look apologetic. She just looked calm. And when she finally acknowledged Thomas's presence, it was not with panic or guilt, but a kind of quiet resolve. She dipped her head slightly, a subtle tilt that carried the weight of both respect and defiance. As if saying, yes, I know what you see. And I'm not sorry you saw it. Thomas took a breath, his jaw stiffening. His mind raced, calculations of risk, damage, headlines. Not that he feared scandal. It was something else. Something more primitive. The fear of his son breaking, again. He opened his mouth, half-formed sentences ready to spill. What the hell do you think you're doing? Who told you this was okay? But the words didn't come. Because something in the boy's posture stopped him. Henry wasn't curled inward. He wasn't wincing or bracing. His shoulders were relaxed, his eyes unfocused in that dreamlike way only children possess when they're not being watched, or when they've forgotten they're usually not allowed to be. He looked peaceful. And that unsettled Thomas more than anything. He didn't know what to do with peace. That's when Nina spoke. Barely above a whisper. Her voice soft enough that no one else could have heard unless they leaned in. Her eyes didn't challenge him, but neither did they flinch. Let him, she said. He's not trying to control. He's just trying to feel. The words struck like a quiet hammer. Not because they were rebellious, but because they named something Thomas had never thought to name. Trying to feel. He always assumed Henry's aversion to touch meant fragility, overload, fear. But he had never considered that what the boy wanted wasn't to shut the world out. It was to let it in carefully on his own terms. Thomas's fingers curled slightly at his side, a tremor in the muscle of his forearm. He looked back at Henry, still perfectly still, hands still resting. The string hadn't made a sound. But something inside Thomas had. That night, the house was quieter than usual. The Gale estate sat on the edge of the hills, cloaked in soft shadows, the kind that made even the chandeliers seem hesitant to shine too brightly. Thomas had retreated to his study after dinner, a glass of untouched bourbon on the side table, and Henry had disappeared down the hall like always. No goodnights, no fanfare, just the soft patter of footsteps and a door clicking shut behind him. But something tugged at Thomas's instincts. He stood and wandered, not with urgency, but with a father's habitual check-in, the kind he rarely admitted doing. He passed the hallway paintings, the tall windows, the grand staircase. When he reached the family room, he saw a faint movement out of the corner of his eye. Henry wasn't in his room. He was standing in front of the tall French windows that overlooked the back garden, his silhouette barely illuminated by the wall sconce behind him. The curtains on those windows were heavy floor-length, held open by ornate velvet ropes, with cords that hung just low enough to tempt any child's curiosity. Thomas didn't speak at first. He just watched. Henry reached out one hand, the same one he'd rested on the harp string earlier that day, and touched the curtain cord gently. He didn't yank it or pull to adjust the drape. Instead, he hooked his finger around one strand and tugged with the lightest pressure, like he was coaxing a note from something not meant to make music. The cord trembled. Just a little. A barely there motion, almost too soft to see, but Thomas saw it. Then Henry let go. The cord swung faintly, making a tiny sound as the decorative tassel at its end brushed the wall. The boy stepped back, watching its movement, his expression still, almost contemplative. Thomas cleared his throat softly. "What are you doing, Henry?" The boy didn't turn. He waited for the cord to still, for the quiet to settle again. And then, without facing his father, he said, "I was just checking." A pause. "If it knows how to be quiet, and still be pretty." Thomas blinked. The sentence landed like a whisper on glass, fragile, unexpected, and echoing louder the longer it sat in the room. He'd never heard Henry describe anything that way before. Beauty, stillness, sound, these had never been part of his vocabulary, let alone strung together into something so intentional. Thomas stepped forward slowly, unsure whether to respond or not. Henry remained still. "I didn't pull hard," the boy added after a few seconds, almost as an afterthought. "I know," Thomas replied, quietly. And he did. He had seen it. Felt it, even. Because it wasn't about the pull. It was about what followed. The way Henry let go, and listened. Waited. Observed how the world moved in response to a simple touch, and whether that world chose to react with chaos or grace. Thomas looked at the boy, not with scrutiny this time, but with a kind of uncertainty. As if something long calcified in him had begun to ache again, like a nerve waking up. Henry finally turned, eyes meeting his father's, not with fear, not with pride, just honesty. "I didn't want to break it," he said. "I know," Thomas answered again, this time softer. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like the moment after a song ends, when no one claps because they're still holding the note in their chest. And in that moment, Thomas realized, maybe his son wasn't afraid of sound. Maybe he was learning how to trust it, slowly, one vibration at a time. The dining room was quiet, save for the occasional clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversations between couples who had no idea what had just shifted in the air the night before. Thomas Gale stood near the bar, his suit jacket still perfectly pressed, though his tie was slightly loosened, a rare concession. He wasn't there to eat. He hadn't even reserved a table. He was waiting. Nina noticed him before he spoke. She was wiping down a service tray, the same one she used each night, like clockwork. When she glanced up and saw him, she didn't flinch. She placed the tray down gently and walked over, tying the back of her apron as she did. They stood a few feet apart, the billionaire and the waitress, separated more by history than by space. Thomas looked at her, eyes narrowed but not in anger. There was something unreadable in his expression. Not contempt. Not approval. Just, wait. "I saw what you did," he said finally. Nina said nothing. He let the words hang before continuing. "You let him near the harp. You didn't stop him." Still, she didn't answer. Thomas exhaled, slow and controlled, as if trying to decide how much of himself to show. He stepped slightly closer, voice lower now. "Do you think a sound, a string being touched, is going to change my son?" Nina didn't answer right away. She didn't rush to defend herself, or to apologize. She looked at him, really looked, not at his title, not at the cold authority he wore like armor, but at the man who had stood in silence the night before, watching his son reach toward something fragile. "No," she said softly. That made him pause. "I don't think it will change him." She let that sit for a moment, and then added, "But I think he needs to know that not everything he reaches for will either scream back or disappear." Thomas's brow furrowed, not in confusion, but something closer to discomfort. Nina continued, her voice calm, unwavering. "Sometimes, it's not the sound that matters. It's the answer. He's not trying to play. He's not trying to impress. He's just hoping something will respond. Without hurting. Without hiding." Thomas looked away, just for a second. No one had ever put it that way before. Every report, every therapist, every specialist had focused on what Henry couldn't handle: noise, touch, unpredictability. But no one had ever suggested that Henry wasn't avoiding the world out of fear, but approaching it carefully, out of need. A need to feel, and to be felt. "He doesn't trust the world," Nina said, more gently now. "But that doesn't mean he doesn't want to." That hit somewhere deeper than Thomas expected. He tightened his grip on the edge of the bar, grounding himself. He had spent years building barriers, not just around Henry, but around his own expectations. He thought protection meant silence, that stability meant control. He thought eliminating risk would keep his son from breaking. But he had never considered what it might do to a boy who only wanted one gentle sound to respond when he reached out. Thomas turned his gaze back to Nina. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look like she had won an argument. She looked tired, but steady. The kind of tired that comes from carrying quiet truths for too long. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came. No rebuttal. No deflection. Just silence. Because for once, silence felt appropriate. It arrived mid-morning before the lunch rush began, in a crate so carefully packed that the delivery men whispered without realizing. The hostess had to sign for it, wide-eyed and blinking, as if unsure whether a mistake had been made. Nina wasn't working yet. She arrived 30 minutes later to find the wooden case standing in the middle of the stage like a relic. There was no return address. No branding. Just a single cream envelope taped to the front, her name printed in the center in black ink, Nina Carter. Inside was a note, no logo, no signature. Just a message in clean, deliberate handwriting. "Put this where he can reach it. Don't warn him." Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the rest of the letter, but that was all there was. No explanation. No conditions. No thank you. She didn't need to ask who it was from. The crate had been built with love and money. Reinforced corners. Lined interior. Padding soft enough to cushion even the most delicate frame. It took 3 servers, the bartender, and Nina herself to carefully pry open the top without damaging anything. And then she saw it. The harp wasn't like the one already on the stage. Not a museum piece or a decorative giant built to impress. This one was smaller, gentler in curve. Its frame was carved mahogany, not gold-plated. Its strings shimmered in the light, and woven near the top row were several strands in soft, pale green, subtle but unmistakable. Nina reached forward and gently plucked one. It sang. Not loudly. Not richly. But clearly. A pure tone, like breath catching on glass, that trembled just enough to be felt before it faded. The green strings were lighter in tension. Easier to move. Easier to vibrate with the faintest touch. She understood instantly. This wasn't a gift. It was a gesture. A doorway. She turned back to the envelope, rereading the final line, "Don't warn him." That, more than anything, said everything. Thomas wasn't asking for a performance. He wasn't hoping to provoke a response. He wasn't orchestrating a scene. He was making space. And trusting that the boy would enter it if, and only if, it felt safe. By the time the dinner shift began, The old harp had been moved to a back corner of the stage. The new one took its place, seated lower, the bench angled slightly, not centered but to the side, the same position Nina had once taken. No one mentioned the change. The manager didn't ask. The other staff raised eyebrows, but said nothing. It wasn't part of a new music program. There was no schedule posted. It simply existed now, in plain view, available, reachable. And that night, Nina made sure to serve tables farther from the stage. She didn't look toward Henry when he arrived. She didn't even check to see if he noticed the switch. But she made sure the lighting stayed soft. Just enough to catch a glint of green when the strings breathed. The room didn't look like a classroom. There were no desks, no blackboards, no laminated rules on the walls. Just soft rugs, scattered cushions, and a handful of low wooden benches. In the center stood a small harp, the same one from the restaurant, with its pale green strings still woven like a quiet signal. Above the doorway, someone had painted a simple phrase in lowercase letters. Soft Sound. That was the name they gave it, the program Thomas and Nina built together. Not a school. Not therapy. Just space. A space for children who were too often told they were too much or not enough. A space for kids like Henry. It had taken weeks of planning. Thomas had spared no expense, but insisted on discretion. No press releases. No donor plaques. The goal wasn't visibility. It was resonance. They'd converted an old reception hall on the quiet end of town. Stripped away the stage lights, filled the corners with textured fabrics, and removed anything that blinked, buzzed, or overwhelmed. Only natural light during the day. Soft lamps at dusk. And no one was ever asked to speak unless they wanted to. On the first day, they opened the doors not with an announcement, but by simply leaving them ajar. 5 children came. Most were accompanied by parents who hovered nervously at the threshold. Some tried to stay, others left quickly, as if afraid their presence might disrupt whatever fragile balance the room held. Nina was there, kneeling near the harp, wiping it down with a cloth as if it were something sacred. She didn't smile too big. She didn't try to make anyone feel welcome. She just moved gently. Intentionally. And Henry? He walked in on his own. No prompting. No push. He moved across the room in that same careful way he always had, not out of fear but precision, and stopped beside the harp. Nina stepped back. He didn't sit. He didn't look around. He simply reached out one hand and plucked a green string. It vibrated, faintly, like the breath between two thoughts. No one clapped. No one reacted. No one told him what a brave boy he was. And then, something remarkable happened. A little girl, no older than 6, tiptoed closer. She didn't say a word. She sat cross-legged beside Henry and placed 2 fingers on a different string, didn't pluck it, just touched it. Then another child, a boy with noise-canceling headphones, sat on the opposite side and rested his hand flat against the wooden frame. By the time the 3rd child joined, there was no more space around the harp, only presence. No chords. No melodies. Just contact. The room didn't erupt in noise. It didn't transform into a concert. But the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Alive. The kind of silence that wraps around you like warm air after a long winter. And in that silence, Thomas stepped inside. He didn't go to the front. He didn't hover near Henry. He didn't announce who he was or what this place meant to him. He simply found the seat farthest from the center, a plain wooden chair tucked into the corner, and sat. For the first time in years, he didn't watch his son to measure distance or danger. He just watched. And he breathed. Maybe that was the real miracle. Not that Henry had found something to touch, but that Thomas had found a place to let go. If you've ever hesitated to reach for something fragile, not out of fear that it might break, but out of fear that it might not answer back, remember this. Some things don't shatter when touched. they awaken. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD, if you believe that even the softest contact can bring something to life. And tell us, when was the last time you reached out, and the world responded with kindness?